In our final lecture on Congress, we're going to look more at the characteristics of members of Congress in terms of their demographics, what influences their behavior within the institution, and kind of the consequences of those things. What we're going to start with is the demographics. We're going to look at what Congress members look like as a whole, and we're going to think about how this might impact just how representative they can be of the people that they represent. Another way to put that is, who are our members of the House and Senate? First thing to remember is they are almost entirely either Republicans, members of the GOP, Grand Old Party, or Democrats. Usually there's 1 to 2 independents. Right now, as of 2026, there are 2 independents in the Senate, Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Angus King of Maine. But even those tiny number of independents still are only able to effectively work within the institution by caucusing either with Democrats or Republicans, and currently both caucus with the Democrats in the Senate. In terms of their demographics, it is impossible to avoid the conclusion that they are demographically unrepresentative of the nation as a whole. This bar graph helps illustrate that point. The orangish bars here signify the proportion of each demographic group in the general reading that entirely backwards. The general population is the turquoisey bit that goes with each of the demographic categories. Senate is the kind of burgundy maroonish bit, and then the House is the orangish bit. There we go. We should get that right. And so one of the things you will often notice is that the Senate tends to be less representative than the House, demographically speaking. But both chambers are substantially whiter than the general population, and other groups, of course, for that to be possible, have to be disproportionately underrepresented. That unrepresentativeness carries over also when we think about the balance of men and women in Congress. This bar graph here, the smaller inset, is the Senate, and the larger is, of course, the House. And what we can see, and if you look at the breakdown of the bars, blue line signifies women, Democrats in Congress, red, Republican women in Congress. And what we do notice is there has been a substantial climb, but as economists would point out, that this is growth from a very low base. And as of the current Congress, the 119th, which will run until 2027, only a quarter of the Senate women and 29% of members of the House are women. And of course, in the adult population, women are slightly more than half of the population. And I suppose we should consider that since the Senate is also much older than the nation as a whole, and the gender imbalance, the sex imbalance between males and females grows larger as we get older. For the demographic groups that these senators actually belong to, and members of the House belong to in terms of their age, women are even more represented, because it turns out men die younger, largely because we do foolish and reckless things and make poor health choices. So we've got that going for us, gentlemen. All right. And this leads to the question, why are there so few women? I mean, it's not to overlook the question of why is there a disproportionate overrepresentation of white Americans and an underrepresentation of other ethnic groups. Those are also important questions, and we will kind of see some of the reasons for that when we get into some topics later on. But one of the questions that is highlighted in our curriculum is the question of why there are so few women in Congress. First thing to point out, it is not because they do not win when they run, especially if we're talking about the House. 64% of women who ran in the House, and this was in a previous election, 2024 statistics, they won 64% of their races when they ran for the House. Now, in the Senate, it is a far lower proportion. 27% won in the Senate. I think we'll be able to kind of give some explanation for why there's that disparity in the success rates between the two chambers. But for now, let's move on to the next thing. It is also not because voters see them as less qualified. And oftentimes women are rated more highly on lots of qualities that voters want to see, like competence, integrity. So it's also not that. But if the candidates are deemed to be of equal quality, then in voters, you do see kind of a default back to the male. So the bias against women can come back in that sense. And as I said, we talk about kind of the disparity in the success rates in the House and the Senate, and this is kind of just would be a hypothesis if I'm being charitable to myself, and a conjecture if I'm probably being more honest. But remember, when we talk about House versus Senate races, in Senate races, you are far more likely to see two strong candidates. Because remember, in the Senate, we always get stronger challengers. In general, we get stronger challenges in Senate races than we do in House races. If we have stronger challengers versus incumbents, or if it's an open seat, just two people trying to vie for that open seat, if we have two strong candidates, it's more likely that they're going to be judged equal, and then that default to the male as voter's choice certainly comes in a big way. And so that may be what's explaining that difference in the success rates in the Senate. That's just kind of speculative on my part. Another reason there are fewer women is that there are differences in partisan primaries. If you do notice in these charts, the blue bars are much taller than the red bars, and they are stacked on top of each other. So you can compare heights, right, within the same column or the same year, however you want to think about it. And so these taller blue bars represent a larger number of Democrat women in both chambers compared to Republican women. Women are more successful coming through the Democrat primary process than the Republican primary process. We have not talked about primary elections really at all, because of the way the order of this goes. But just in case you need the reminder or the introduction, we have primaries before the general election in order to figure out which particular Republican or Democrat will be the candidate on that ballot in November, whether it's November of a presidential election year or a midterm year. And women are less successful coming through the Republican primary process. They're more likely to be defeated by men at that stage. And so a man goes on the general election ballot for Republicans. And the Democrat Party, women have a higher success rate in the primary process. And this starts to paint the picture of what ends up being perhaps the most important explanation of why there are so few women in Congress. And that is because they do not make it to the general election. And that is not all just about partisan primary differences. A lot of the story is that women are simply less likely to run for Congress. And one of the reasons for this is risk aversion. Now, I want you to be very careful in how you interpret that detail. And This does not mean that women are more scared to get into the process and fight for a seat in office. But, and evolutionary biologists and political scientists who draw on evolutionary biology have noticed for quite some time and have written about and researched the consequences that women tend to be more risk averse than men. And again, that doesn't mean scared. They are just less willing to take risks. And partly because from the evolutionary biologist perspective, early women had to coexist with very reckless men who lived in a very dangerous world where horrible accidents could actually be the result of fairly minor things. But if you break a leg, get a compound fracture, 40,000 years ago, you're probably done. Or you could actually get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. Those kinds of things. Women had to be more risk averse in order to coexist with these risk acceptant men to ensure that the children they had with those risk acceptant men could grow to adulthood and make their own babies. That's probably more background on this than you wanted. Sorry, but I want you to kind of understand where this comes from. So if a female candidate is looking at a race where she perceives the prospects of winning to be low, she's more likely to sit that race out. Whereas, if you want to take this from a less flattering perspective on males, a male candidate might just in a foolhardy way, just plow right into a race they are unlikely to win. But the result is we have a selection effect, again, where women simply choose not to run. But the flip side of this is that they seem to be better than men, perhaps, at spotting an opportunity, right? An opening to win an open seat or challenge an incumbent. And this is part of the reason that when they do run, especially in the case of those House races, they have very good odds of winning. Another reason that women are less likely to run for Congress is because of family responsibilities. And all of this is in general. When I talk about these things, students will always point out, well, in my household, all right, my father does the cooking, he does lots of the cleaning, right? He runs kids to their practices and helps them with their homework. And in a lot of those cases, that's true. That was true in my household growing up a long time ago. In my own household today, the vast majority of the cooking is done by me. But right, in general, I'm not bragging about myself. I'm just talking, I want you to understand that your personal experience may be radically different from the norm. And the norm is that women still have more family responsibilities. For women, it's often called the second shift. They go to work just like their male partners, but after work, they end up bearing the burden of much more of the work of running a household. And with all that, they have less time to build a political career than their male counterparts. So that's a long explanation for why there are so few women in Congress. Let's return to the bigger picture when we're talking about all of these demographic characteristics. What it means, I think the upshot of this, is most members of Congress cannot provide what is called descriptive representation. They do not look like their constituents, or at least not a substantial number of their constituents. Instead, for representativeness, we rely on substantive representation. And this is the idea that even if we have an old white male member of Congress who does not look like their constituents, or at least not a large number of them, they can still empathize and they can still listen to constituents and they can represent their interests anyway. And so I don't want you to think that substantive representation is kind of just a throwaway justification. I mean, we can argue to the extent that it is effective in representing minority interests or the interests of women, but substantive representation is the kind that we can have, right, in a body that is demographically unrepresentative. From there, let's shift gears to member behavior and the influences on how they decide to behave in Congress. There are several influences, and it's going to be kind of a grab bag of things. One is the traditional pressure of leaders on rank and file members of Congress. And here I'm talking about things: Senate Majority Leader, Senate Minority Leader, whips, the Speaker of the House, whips in the House. Those leaders pressure their members, right, to go along with what the leadership wants, right, the legislative agenda they want to accomplish. There is, of course, also another form of leader pressure, and that is presidential influence. The president, as we'll see when we talk about the president, we'll see this again, the president is also known as the chief legislator. And that can seem kind of weird because we've spent a ton of time telling you that the president is the chief executive. And the president is. But they are also the chief legislator in the sense that a lot of their ideas become legislative priorities. You saw this when we compared the use of the discharge petition in the 73rd and 119th Congresses. Speaker Rainey in the 73rd Congress was very focused on passing legislation that would enact Franklin Roosevelt's, the president's, policy agenda. And so presidents can put a lot of pressure on. Of course, we've also talked about this before, the bully pulpit. The president is able to set the policy agenda far more effectively than any other elected official in the federal government because they can get the attention. Right? If the president's going to give a speech, it will be streamed pretty much everywhere. Broadcast cable news networks will stop whatever they were doing and they will carry that speech. And even when it's not speeches, things that the president says will get picked up and reported on the news, whereas for the 535 members of Congress, they have no way of getting similar attention, not even if you're the Speaker or the Senate Majority Leader. And we've seen some of that. One of the cases of this is President Trump, especially in his second term, using that bully pulpit to target for criticism and perhaps political opposition members of the Republican Party that have gone against him in Congress. So Representative Thomas Massie is one of those cases. Of course, this example is from early in Trump's second term, but Thomas Massie has again been in the crosshairs over the discharge petition to force the release of the Epstein files. Marjorie Taylor Greene, once a darling of Donald Trump and his supporters, also went against the president's wishes on the Epstein files discharge petition. It was also targeted. Right? And as a result, seems largely of that will not be remaining in Congress. She's going to resign her seat. So, and those are examples of kind of president's influence not bringing the behavior. But those examples are so notable because in the vast majority of cases, presidential influence has bottled up any opposition. To the extent that it exists, we may not hear about it because those members of Congress keep quiet and go along with the agenda. I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way. I mean, we're talking about the policy agenda of the president. There's also ideology and party, and these two have not always been the same thing. There was a long period of Congress where we talked about Southern Democrats as a particular species of Democrat because they were conservative. Today, there has been ideological and partisan polarization in the same direction, and you can see that in this graphic here. There has been a tendency for liberals, Democrats here, to move in a more liberal direction, and for Republicans, conservatives, to move in a more conservative direction. Although, of course, as the label for this graph points out, the move has been more pronounced among Republicans than it has been among Democrats. Although the House, not surprising, being the more responsive and representative chamber, since members are elected every 2 years, has moved noticeably more to the left. As there's been ideological polarization within the parties, cohesion within the parties has increased. This has been reinforced by an increase in the number of safe seats. There again, especially talking about the House, which has resulted in more extreme representatives, although in the Senate it's more pronounced for the Republicans than it is in the House. But in any case, big picture, I don't want you to lose sight of the forest for the trees. We have more polarization in the parties, more cohesive parties. Safe seats have reinforced more ideologically extreme representatives. We'll see another reason for that in a bit, just a bit. Related to this is also campaign finance leverage, and here kind of traditional leadership also gets bound up with this. Parties are able to run, and leaders within parties are able to raise tremendous funds for helping members of Congress win election or re-election. And here we're primarily talking about re-election. Party leaders who have a lot of sway over how these funds are distributed can say, look, if you don't go along with what we want, we will not financially support you in your next election. And so that finance leverage can be an important factor. There's also, and this would be something that's kind of more complicated, information asymmetry. Just refers to one side knowing more than the other. And a lot of times that can be exploited in all kinds of situations. In this case, leaders often know more. We saw in unorthodox lawmaking the omnibus bill, where tons and tons of things are packed into a bill. The bill is so big, nobody knows everything that is in it. Probably the chief example of this, although its actual meaning is still debated, in passing the large bill that was the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Speaker at the time, Nancy Pelosi, said that we have to pass it before we know what's in it. And so leaders, the members can't know everything. The leaders have a much better sense of what is actually in the bill. And so they can selectively tell members what they want members to know about it in order to motivate them to support it. And so that can be an influence on members. And the members are aware of this asymmetry. There's just not much they can do about it. Ideology and party, in terms of just how the ideology of a member of Congress influences their legislative behavior. The strongest influences are for economic legislation, things like tax policy or trade policy, where historically Democrats have been more in favor of higher taxes. Republicans have been in favor of lower taxes. Republicans historically, say especially in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, Republicans were more in favor of free trade, and Democrats were more likely to be opposed to free trade. And party influence was strong on those things. And it still is. It's just shifting in terms of, especially on the issue of trade, what the parties want. Also, of course, on social spending. How much is the government going to spend on Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, things of that nature? There you tend to see a pretty sharp partisan divide between Republicans and Democrats, with, in general, Republicans favoring less spending and Democrats favoring more. Although in recent years, on the issue of Social Security, because, well, let's face it, old people vote and young people are far less likely to, there is less partisan difference on Social Security spending and Medicare, because those are two programs that benefit elderly Americans. All right, that's kind of an aside. I want you to, again, don't lose sight of this. Strongest influence, economic legislation, social spending, and often we think about that as welfare, with Republicans being more likely to oppose higher levels of welfare spending or want reductions, and Democrats favoring more of this social spending. If you're wondering, well, where are the people the representatives represent in this whole story? Well, they do matter. Constituents do have effect on the behavior of members of Congress. Of course, some of this is in terms of selecting who those people actually are going to be. If a member of Congress is in a less safe seat, right, then they have to worry about their district or states as a whole. If you are in a safe seat or a red or blue state, you may have some more leeway to move in a more conservative or liberal direction, depending, again, on the color of your district or the color of your state. And if you're in a vulnerable district or what we call a purple state, a state that's not truly blue and not truly red, you may have to make sure that your behavior in Congress is kind of down the middle. Right? It may moderate what you do in terms of how you go along with your party or ideology or any of those things. But right, even if you are in a very safe seat, right, your constituents' support is not something you can always take for granted. One of the phrases that has become very much in use when talking about congressional elections in more recent years is getting primaried, which means your challenge is not from the other party at the general election. Your challenge is at the primary from other members of your own party. And for some members, this is their biggest threat. This is also a reason that we see kind of more extreme representatives coming out of safer seats. It's not just that they are free to be more liberal or free to be more conservative. They are actually constrained, because what they have to fear is that they are seen as not conservative enough or not progressive enough, and then they face a primary challenge, and that is what knocks them out of their seat. And so, one way or another, members of Congress are very sensitive to what it's going to take to be reelected. And the influence is not just limited to every 2 years for members of the House or every 6 years for members of the Senate. There is influence. And we can see that in this bar graph here. And different things have different levels of influence. The darker blue bar signifies a lot of influence. In when they say positive influence, okay, they mean influence that moves a member or senator in a particular direction. And lighter blue bar is some positive influence. So some things, email messages, don't have a lot of impact. And we'll kind of talk about why that is. But the simple way to think about some of these things is what economists call costly signals. And a costly signal is something that it's a signal I send to you that requires some personal cost on my part. It might be time, it might be money, but it shows to you that I am serious about what I want and how I feel about something. Email messages are not very costly to send, and they're interpreted as not being very serious, and we see them as having far less effect than other things. Right? Phone call, for one thing, it's awkward for a lot of people, especially for younger people. or people who grew up when texting had become a thing and people communicated more that way than by calling other people. So phone calls have become a relatively costly signal, and they're more impactful. If you actually go in person to visit your senator or House member, that is likely to be very impactful. You have had to take the time to travel to that place. It might be a local office, but it might also be going to our nation's capital and taking the time and trouble to arrange an in-person meeting with your senator or representative. That is a very costly signal, and it is interpreted as such and taken seriously. In general, whatever the form of contact, when constituents are uninformed, they don't have influence. Information asymmetry is another issue here. The member of Congress realizes that when their constituents don't know about a thing, it also probably means they don't care about a thing, and so the constituent can make their own decision on how to support or oppose that policy. Interest groups are also a factor. They are often linked with constituents because constituents give money to interest groups. Lobbyists, these are the people who they get their name from the practice of hanging out in the lobbies of Congress and offices and trying to influence members of Congress. And visits from lobbyists can be pretty effective, not as strongly as other things, but still have some influence. The visit from a lobbyist may not be that influential, right? But if the interest group also bring money into the equation, whether in terms of financial support for that candidate's reelection or a threat that if the candidate doesn't support the policy the interest group wants, they might oppose that candidate in the next election. Some examples of interest groups would be Planned Parenthood, spending the money, attaching their name to a candidate. National Rifle Association, same story. Planned Parenthood much more supportive of Democrat candidates. National Rifle Association much more likely to be supporting Republican candidates, not because of just partisanship, but because of how those parties tend to fall on those two issues. And so, of course, with that, it's not just the money, but it is the endorsement itself. People who support these interest groups, they will look for the grade cards that these organizations sometimes put out to let people know just how much an interest group views a candidate favorably and in line with the interest group's goals. And this has become a source of worry for critics of this interest group influence. There is a big concern that money has become the dominant factor in what members of Congress do. And they become much more concerned about how what they do will affect their fundraising than what their constituents might really want or need. And the concern here is that because there is lots of money in American politics coming from lots of different directions, that we can get that hyper-pluralism problem, where there are simply so many different demands on Congress members from so many different directions, and there's so much pressure to go along with it that our policy process becomes just snarled, and we cannot move and accomplish things in policy. And finally, we also need to talk about how influences kind of get filtered through the personal characteristics, and really the decision-making processes of representatives. Now, there are lots of ways to do that, but for this class, it's in terms of talking about different types of representatives. Some representatives are referred to as delegates, meaning they see themselves as a person who was picked by their constituents specifically to represent what those constituents want when they want it. They are very in tune to input they're receiving from their constituents, and that input influences greatly what that representative does. Another model of representative is the trustee. They see themselves as someone who was selected by their constituents because the constituents trust that person to exercise their own independent judgment. So they are more likely to go against what their constituents want at a particular time because they think that they have been selected because they know best, or at least exercise good judgment. And sometimes their idea of good judgment may differ from what their constituents want. And so they would be less sensitive to constituent input. Then there are the partisans. And this is going to be what you think it sounds like. These are representatives, members of the House, the Senate, that toe the party line. What does the party leadership want? That's what we're going to do. I'll try and sell it to the constituents back home, but I'm going to go with what the party wants. And the fourth are the politicos. Politicos are really, at this point, the typical representative. And what it means is they are a blend of delegate, trustee, and partisans. And for this reason, I don't put a lot of weight in these different models of representation. Because if you were a blend of the other three, and most members are blends of the other three, which means most of them are politicos, then the idea that there are really 4 distinct models or even 3 distinct models is not helpful from an analytical perspective, right, and helping us understand what makes members of Congress tick. But you do need to know about it. It is something that shows up on tests that other people write for you, and people who are not me. Personally, I would not put a lot of weight on this. Now let's zoom out, as this is the final lecture, and think about the big picture of Congress and our democracy with some final thoughts. One, Congress is elitist. And some of the demographic data we've talked about today, our representatives differ a lot from the people they represent. And some of the information you have in your packet of cheat sheets. You can also notice that members of Congress are from what are often thought of as elite professions. Lawyers. Most members of Congress have had some kind of background in the legal profession or something adjacent to it. They tend to be wealthier than the people they represent. And some of this is because, really, it may sound kind of perverse to say it, but it's quite possible we don't pay members of Congress enough. To be a member of Congress and go along with and be able to support the expenses of having 2 homes and all of the other things that go along with being a member of Congress, you really kind of have to be independently wealthy or get wealthy pretty quickly in order to stay in our Congress. For those reasons, Congress is elitist. And that is despite the fact that now, since the 17th Amendment, all members of Congress, House and Senate, are popularly elected. At the same time, Congress is also still influenced from outside. These are not just elites, right, who make the decisions all on their own, right, based on what they think is best. They are influenced by their constituents. They are influenced by interest groups, lobbying, and especially money. And that leaves us with a question, like, where does Congress fit? Is this an elitist theory of democracy, where it is just the wealthy and the connected that kind of run things? Is it pluralist, where we have lots of input from constituents and interest groups? Or are we at the point where there's so much interest group influence and so much interest group money from all kinds of different directions that we are in this hyper-pluralist situation of basically policy stagnation through snarling or gridlock? So in terms of final thoughts, the last thing I can really leave you with is that big and yet unanswered question. But that is where we will stop our examination, at least through lecture, of Congress.